On March 7, 1945, a 22-year-old American lieutenant stood at the edge of a bridge that was supposed to explode at any moment. Behind him, his battalion commander had just asked a question that sounded more like a death sentence. "Do you think you can get your company across that bridge?" The bridge was wired with over 6,000 pounds of explosives. German machine guns covered every inch of its span. The enemy had already tried to blow it once. They would try again, and when they did, everyone on that bridge would die. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann looked at the bridge, looked at his men, and gave the only answer a soldier could give. "Well, we can try it, sir." He asked one more question. "What if the bridge blows up in my face?" His commander didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew the answer. This is the story of the most important bridge crossing of World War II. The bridge that shortened the war by weeks. The bridge that Hitler was so furious about losing that he executed his own officers and the young lieutenant who led the charge across it, even though he knew it might kill him. This is the story of Karl Timmermann and the bridge at Remagen. By March 1945, Nazi Germany was dying. The Third Reich, that was supposed to last 1,000 years, was collapsing after just 12. Soviet forces were crushing through from the east. British and American armies were driving in from the west. German cities were burning. The Luftwaffe was decimated. The Wehrmacht was retreating on all fronts. But there was still one barrier, one last natural defense that could buy Germany time. The Rhine River. The Rhine is no ordinary river. It's over 700 miles long, more than 1,000 feet wide in places, swift, deep, and deadly. Since the days of the Roman Empire, it had served as Germany's shield against invasion from the west. Every great army that tried to cross it paid in blood. In early 1945, it was still holding. The Germans had destroyed nearly every bridge across the Rhine as they retreated, blown them to rubble before the Allies could reach them. The few bridges that remained were so heavily defended that attacking them would be suicide. Allied commanders knew they would have to mount massive amphibious crossings, complicated operations that would take weeks to plan and cost thousands of lives. Nobody expected to find a bridge still standing. Nobody expected to capture one intact, and nobody, absolutely nobody, expected that bridge to be at Remagen, a small town about 15 miles south of Bonn, where the terrain on both sides was so rough that tanks could barely maneuver. But on March 7, 1945, soldiers of the 9th Armored Division came around a hillside and saw something that made them blink in disbelief. The Ludendorff Bridge was still standing. The bridge at Remagen was built during World War I. It was named after General Erich Ludendorff, Germany's master strategist, and constructed between 1916 and 1919 primarily by Russian prisoners of war who were worked to exhaustion building it. It was a railroad bridge, over 1,000 feet long, supported by massive stone towers on both banks and resting on enormous piers in the river itself. It was built to last. The Russians who constructed it, whether through spite or skill, built it too well. The concrete was stronger than it needed to be. The steel was thicker. The foundations went deeper. It had survived bombing raids throughout the war. It had been hit multiple times by Allied aircraft and kept standing. By March 1945, it was one of only 3 bridges still standing across the entire Rhine River in that sector. The Germans knew how valuable it was. They had wired it with about 800 kilograms of demolition charges, enough explosive power to drop a mountain into the river. All they had to do was push a button and the bridge would disappear. But there was a problem. Several problems, actually. Adolf Hitler, in one of his many fits of paranoid rage, had created a situation where German officers were terrified to make decisions. In October 1944, an American bomb had accidentally hit the demolition chamber of a bridge in Cologne, setting off the charges and destroying it. Hitler was furious. He ordered that all demolition charges on bridges be removed and only replaced when the enemy was within 5 miles. And even then, the bridge could only be destroyed with written orders from a commanding officer. He court-martialed the officers he blamed for the Cologne bridge loss. This sent a message to every other bridge commander in Germany. Blow the bridge too early, and Hitler will have you shot. Let the Americans capture it, and Hitler will have you shot. Either way, you're dead. So the officers in charge of the Remagen bridge hesitated. They argued. They waited for orders. They transferred command back and forth. On March 6th, just 1 day before the Americans arrived, command of the bridge was transferred to Major Hans Scheller. He didn't even arrive in Remagen until 11:15 in the morning on March 7th. By then, the Americans were already on the way. Karl Timmermann was born on June 19, 1922, in Frankfurt, Germany. His father was an American soldier of German ancestry named John Timmermann, who had been stationed in Germany as part of the post-World War I Army of Occupation. In 1921, John Timmermann went absent without leave. He met a German woman named Maria Weisbecker at a dance hall. They fell in love. They married in Frankfurt in 1922, and Karl was born soon after. John Timmermann was now a deserter, a fugitive from the United States Army. He lived in Germany with his German wife and his half-German son for 2 years before finally, with the help of American Quakers, managing to slip back into the United States with his family in January 1924. They settled in West Point, Nebraska. John Timmermann lived as a fugitive for 4 more years before finally turning himself in to military authorities in 1928. He was dishonorably discharged and briefly incarcerated. The Timmermann name was disgraced. Young Karl grew up knowing his father was a deserter. He endured taunts from other kids. Coward, traitor, disgrace. He heard the whispers, he saw the looks, and he made a decision. He would restore his family's honor. He would prove that the Timmermann name meant something. On July 6, 1940, barely 18 years old, Karl Timmermann enlisted in the United States Army. He was assigned to the 15th Infantry Regiment at Fort Lewis, Washington. After Pearl Harbor, he trained for war. In October 1942, he was selected for Officer Candidate School. On February 16, 1943, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant. He was assigned to Company A of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, 9th Armored Division. In March 1944, while home on leave, he proposed by letter to a woman named Lavera Meyer, enclosing a ring in the envelope. She accepted by mail. They were married on May 25, 1944, in Omaha, Nebraska. 3 months later, in August 1944, Timmermann and his battalion boarded the Queen Mary and sailed for Europe. They arrived in Scotland, then moved to France, then were sent to Belgium to a sector that was supposed to be quiet, good for green troops who had never seen combat. On December 16, 1944, the Germans launched their last great offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. Timmermann and his men were thrown into the worst fighting of the war. They fought near St. Vith. They watched their friends die. Their entire kitchen staff and supply sergeant were captured and executed by SS troops in what became known as the Malmedy Massacre. Timmermann was wounded by shell fragments, but refused to leave his unit. The 9th Armored Division fought so hard that the Germans twice announced they had destroyed it. They earned the nickname the Phantom Division because they kept appearing where the Germans thought they had been wiped out. On February 28, 1945, Karl Timmermann's wife gave birth to a daughter, Gay Diane. He didn't know. There was no way for the news to reach him. He was fighting in Germany, pushing toward the Rhine. On March 6, 1945, his company commander was wounded in action. That night, Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engerman promoted Timmermann to command of Company A. His first day as a company commander would be March 7th. He was 22 years old. He had been married less than a year. He was a father and didn't know it, and in less than 24 hours, he would become one of the most famous soldiers in the American Army. At 12:56 p.m. on March 7th, 1945, scouts from the 9th Armored Division crested a hill overlooking the town of Remagen. They looked down at the Rhine River and couldn't believe what they were seeing. The Ludendorff Bridge was still standing. German vehicles and troops were streaming across it, a chaotic mass of retreating soldiers mixed with civilians and livestock. Previous Allied air attacks had destroyed the ferries. The bridge was the only way across. Everyone was using it. Lieutenant Timmermann and his platoon leader, Lieutenant Grimbaugh, moved up to see for themselves. They radioed the news to their task force commander, Lieutenant Colonel Engermann. Engermann came forward immediately, studied the bridge through binoculars, and made a decision that would change history. He called Brigadier General William Hogue, his commanding officer. Hogue arrived as quickly as he could, looked at the bridge, and gave an order that was either brilliant or insane. "Seize that bridge! Now!" The order went down the chain. Engermann ordered Timmermann and Company A to take the bridge. Supporting them would be a platoon of brand-new M26 Pershing tanks, the heaviest tanks the Americans had. At 1:50 p.m., Timmermann's infantry set out toward Remagen. The tanks followed 30 minutes later. They moved quickly through the town. Resistance was light. The Germans had put their faith in the bridge demolition, not in ground defense. There was some Volkssturm militia, older men and boys conscripted to defend their homes. There were some anti-aircraft gunners with 20mm flak guns. That was it. By 3:15 p.m., Timmermann and his men had reached the western edge of the bridge, and that's when Major Murray Devers, battalion commander, asked the question, "Do you think you can get your company across that bridge?" Timmermann looked at it. The bridge was huge, over 1,000 feet long, stretching across the wide Rhine. German machine guns were firing from the towers on the far side. Rifle fire was coming from positions on the eastern bank. Soldiers could see the demolition charges attached to the bridge, thick bundles of explosives connected by wires. The bridge could explode at any second. Everyone knew it. The Germans had been trying to blow bridges all across Germany. They wouldn't let this one fall into American hands intact. Any moment now, someone would push a button or light a fuse and the entire structure would disintegrate. "Well, we can try it, sir. What if the bridge blows up in my face?" Devers didn't answer. What could he say? If the bridge exploded, Timmermann and everyone with him would die. There was no way around that. But the opportunity was too great to pass up. An intact bridge across the Rhine, a chance to drive into the heart of Germany weeks ahead of schedule. A chance to end the war faster. Go ahead. At 3:20 p.m., Timmermann started across. He led from the front, the way good officers do. Behind him came his men, spread out, running from cover to cover. The bridge was a railroad bridge, with wooden planks laid over the tracks so vehicles could cross. The planks were old, some broken, gaps showing the river far below. German machine gun fire raked the bridge. Bullets whined off the steel girders. Timmermann and his men ran, dodged, took cover behind the steel supports, ran again. At 3:50 p.m., as Company A reached the western end of the bridge, the Germans detonated a charge near the approach. The explosion was massive. It created a crater 30 feet wide in the bridge approach, making it temporarily impassable for tanks. Smoke and debris filled the air. For a moment, no one could see anything. When the smoke cleared, the bridge was still standing. Timmermann didn't hesitate. If the tanks couldn't cross, the infantry would go alone. He waved his men forward. They ran onto the bridge. They were about 2/3 of the way across when they heard the sound. A deep, industrial click. The sound of a detonator being triggered. The second explosion went off beneath their feet. The bridge seemed to lift into the air. The steel girders screamed. The wooden planking shattered. Men were thrown off their feet. The entire structure shuddered, swayed, and for a moment it seemed like it would collapse into the Rhine, carrying everyone on it to their deaths. And then it settled back down. The bridge was damaged. The main steel diagonal supports on the upstream side were destroyed. There was a section of flooring missing, a 6-inch sag in the span, but the bridge was still standing. The German demolition had failed. Nobody knows exactly why. Some say a bullet had severed the detonation cable. Some say the explosive charges were inadequate. Some say Russian prisoners of war had sabotaged the demolition during construction. Some say it was simply the fact that the bridge was built too well, stronger than anyone realized. Whatever the reason, the bridge held. Timmermann and his men, shaken, ears ringing from the blast, got to their feet and kept moving. They were more than halfway across. German fire intensified. Machine guns hammered at them, rifles cracked. The 20mm flak guns fired explosive shells that burst against the steel. Sergeant Alexander Drabik from Company A was the first enlisted man to reach the eastern bank. He jumped off the bridge, took cover behind a pile of rubble, and started firing back at German positions. Right behind him was Lieutenant Karl Timmermann, the first American officer to cross the Rhine River since Napoleon. They didn't stop. They couldn't. The bridge was still wired with explosives. German engineers might repair the detonation system and blow it at any moment. Timmermann sent men running along the bridge, cutting wires, kicking demolition charges into the river. Others pushed forward into the town of Erpel on the eastern bank, clearing buildings, neutralizing the flak gun positions. The bridge had a tunnel at the eastern end, boring through a 600-foot hill called the Erpeler Lee. Timmermann sent men into the tunnel. It was dark, chaotic. German soldiers and civilians were hiding inside, terrified. Some were wounded, some tried to fight, most surrendered. By 4 p.m., less than 45 minutes after starting across, Karl Timmermann and his men had secured both ends of the Ludendorff Bridge. The Americans were across the Rhine. The news spread like wildfire. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, called it a stroke of fortune worth its weight in gold. Winston Churchill called it an invaluable prize. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall said it demonstrated American initiative and adaptability at its best. Time magazine called it a moment in history. Within 24 hours, over 8,000 American troops crossed the bridge. Within days, 3 full infantry divisions were on the eastern bank of the Rhine. Engineers frantically built pontoon bridges alongside the damaged span. Tanks, trucks, artillery, everything poured across. The Germans were shocked. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, was stunned. The Rhine was supposed to hold. It was supposed to buy Germany time to regroup, to build new defenses. Now the Americans were across and driving into the heart of the Ruhr industrial region. Adolf Hitler was not shocked. He was enraged. He summoned Generalleutnant Rudolf Hübner, described as a fanatical and reliable Nazi, and personally appointed him commander of a special flying court-martial. Hübner's orders were simple: find the officers responsible for losing the bridge and execute them. On March the 10th, 3 days after the bridge was captured, Hitler fired Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of all German forces on the Western Front. It was the 3rd time Hitler had fired him. This time, it stuck. Then the executions began. Major Hans Scheller, the officer who had been given command of the bridge just hours before it was captured. Major Herbert Strobel, an engineer officer. Major August Kraft, another engineer who had laid the demolition charges. Lieutenant Karl Peters, a flak artillery officer accused of allowing one of his guns to be captured. They were arrested. They were given a 20-minute trial on March 17th. None of the judges had any legal training. The trial was a farce. Hübner found them guilty of cowardice and dereliction of duty. At 1 p.m. that same day, the 4 men were taken to a wooded area. They were given 45 minutes to write letters to their families. Then they were shot in the back of the head. The executioners tore up their letters, emptied their pockets, and buried them in shallow, unmarked graves. Field Marshal Model, who had stated that the officers were completely innocent, could do nothing. The orders came from Hitler himself. Captain Willy Bratke, who had been in command of bridge security, was tried in absentia. He was sentenced to death. Captain Karl Friesenhahn, the engineer responsible for the demolition, was also tried. He was acquitted because the court found he had done everything possible to destroy the bridge. It didn't matter. Both men were already American prisoners of war, captured when Timmermann's men cleared the tunnel. For Karl Timmermann, the days after the bridge crossing were a blur. The 9th Armored Division expanded the bridgehead, fighting off German counterattacks. Hitler threw everything he had at Remagen, desperate to destroy the bridge or drive the Americans back across the Rhine. Luftwaffe bombers attacked. W2 rockets were launched at the bridge. German frogmen tried to plant explosives on the piers. Panzer divisions counterattacked the bridgehead. Nothing worked. The Americans held. More troops poured across. Engineers worked around the clock to repair the damaged span and build additional crossings. On March 17th, 10 days after its capture, the Ludendorff Bridge finally collapsed. The cumulative damage from the failed German demolition, Allied bombing raids before the capture, and constant heavy traffic finally became too much. The structure gave way and fell into the Rhine. 28 American engineers who were working on the bridge were killed. Another 93 were wounded. But by then, it didn't matter. The Americans had built 2 pontoon bridges and a Bailey Bridge. Troops and supplies were flowing across the Rhine at 3 separate points. Timmermann was on leave when the bridge collapsed. He was in Paris, reading the Stars and Stripes newspaper, when he learned 3 things. First, he learned he was a father. His daughter, Gay Diane, had been born 2 weeks earlier. Second, he learned he was a hero. The capture of the bridge at Remagen was front-page news around the world. His name was in every paper. He was famous. Third, he learned he had been awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor. Sergeant Drabik received one too. So did Sergeant Joseph Delicio and 10 others. Another 152 men received the Silver Star. Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. A sign was placed on one of the stone bridge towers. Cross the Rhine with dry feet courtesy of the 9th Armored Division. That sign is now at the Patton Museum at Fort Knox, Kentucky. The war in Europe ended 2 months later, in May 1945. Historians agree that the capture of the Remagen Bridge shortened the war by at least 2 weeks, possibly more. It broke open the German defenses on the Rhine. It allowed the Allies to encircle the Ruhr industrial area, Germany's economic heart. It prevented the Germans from regrouping and establishing new defensive lines. General Albert Kesselring, who replaced von Rundstedt, called it the crime of Remagen, saying it broke the front along the Rhine. Hermann Goering said the capture made a long defense impossible. German generals agreed that when the Remagen Bridge fell into American hands, the war was effectively over. But the cost was real. German officers executed for failing to stop what couldn't be stopped. American engineers killed when the bridge finally collapsed. And young men on both sides who died in the fighting for the bridgehead. Karl Timmermann returned to the United States in December 1945 and was discharged from the army. He went home to Nebraska, to his wife and daughter, and tried to build a normal life. He became a salesman, but he missed the army. He missed the structure, the purpose, the camaraderie. In October 1947, he re-enlisted as a technical sergeant. He became a recruiter, then an instructor. With the start of the Cold War, he was recommissioned as a first lieutenant in December 1948. When the Korean War started in 1950, Timmermann volunteered for combat. He landed with the 7th Infantry Division at Incheon in September 1950 and fought for several months. But he started experiencing persistent abdominal pain. He finally went to sick call. The diagnosis was testicular cancer. He was sent back to Fitzsimons Hospital near Denver for treatment. Doctors operated to remove the tumor. The treatment was unsuccessful. The cancer spread. On October 21, 1951, First Lieutenant Karl Timmermann died. He was 29 years old. He had lived less than 7 years after crossing the bridge at Remagen. His wife Lavera later recalled his final days. He detested cancer because of the fact that it was killing him and depriving him of a soldierly duty. He made me promise to polish up his silver bar, his buttons and his medals for the burial. He wanted every battle ribbon in proper place on his chest. He wanted to be as soldierly as possible. A Denver reporter wrote that the cancer called war had failed to take his life in 2 tries. Karl Timmermann was buried at Fort Logan National Cemetery in Colorado, the same post where his father's tarnished military career had begun in 1919. He was given full military honors. The bridge at Remagen was never rebuilt. The twin stone towers on both banks still stand today. Silent guardians of a river crossing that changed history, they house a peace museum now, built by the mayor of Remagen. A plaque on one of the towers reads, "Built for war, destroyed in war. The towers will always remain. Here fought soldiers of 2 great nations. Here died heroes from near and far." In 1965, a park in West Point, Nebraska was dedicated to Timmermann's memory. In 1969, a Hollywood movie called The Bridge at Remagen was made, loosely based on the events of March 7, 1945. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the bridge's capture, his hometown celebrated his accomplishments. Karl Timmermann's story is the story of redemption. A boy born in Germany to a deserter father. A young man who endured taunts and shame. A soldier who volunteered to restore his family's honor. An officer who led his men across a bridge that could have killed them all at any moment. He was given an impossible order. Cross a bridge wired with 6,000 pounds of explosives. Do it while under machine gun fire. Do it knowing the bridge could explode at any second. Do it even though it might be a trap. And he did it. Not because he was reckless, not because he didn't understand the danger. He did it because soldiers were watching, because the mission mattered, because someone had to go first. In war, there are moments when history pivots on the decision of a single person. March 7, 1945 was one of those moments. If Timmermann had refused, if he had hesitated, if he had waited for more support, the Germans would have had time to fix the demolition system and blow the bridge. The opportunity would have been lost, but he didn't hesitate. He went. And because he went, others followed. And because others followed, the bridge was taken. And because the bridge was taken, the war ended sooner. How many lives did that save? Thousands, tens of thousands. There's no way to know. But every day the war ended earlier meant fewer soldiers dying, fewer civilians suffering, fewer families destroyed. Karl Timmermann's father was a deserter. His son became a hero. The Timmermann name, once disgraced, became honored. And the young lieutenant who crossed the bridge at Remagen, who lived only 29 years, left a legacy that endures 80 years later. On March 7, 1945, Karl Timmermann was asked a question. Do you think you can get your company across that bridge? His answer changed the course of World War II. Well, we can try it, sir. And he did.